America burns. Riots and looting from New York to California. These scenes are becoming an all too familiar sight across America, and almost always with the chanting of Black Lives Matter. Let's take a closer look at the motivations of the movement, what they want, and what they've achieved so far. If you've been living under a particularly remote rock, you might be asking yourself what I'm talking about, or what caused this current crisis. The answer to both is the death of Mr. George Floyd. While restraining him, Officer Derek Chauvin knelt on the neck of Mr. Floyd until he stopped breathing. You just have to look at the footage to see how upset the community are at George Floyd's death. Absolutely devastated. Did the police go overboard? Yes, they did. I don't think their intention was to kill him, but regardless, that's what happened, and now we have to deal with it. People want justice for George Floyd. That is completely understandable on its own, but you think the arrest and charges against the officers on the scene would be enough to stop, or at least postpone the riots. But apparently not. In 1992, with the Rodney King beating, it wasn't until the officers involved had gotten off with their charges that the riots actually began. So, what's changed between now and then? What I think is the key thing behind the widespread nature and the ferocity of the riots today are antagonists stoking the flames in every way they can, be it some bad actors inside BLM or Antifa. While some of the groups stoking the flames have admittedly been around for quite a while, with Antifa being in the USA since around the 1980s, but I don't think we've ever seen them quite so organised.
Rose City Antifa holds required lectures for prospecting members in secret.
Police are going to be like, perfect, we can prosecute these look how violent they are. Right? Not that we're not, but we need to hide.
With RCA, it seems much more structured, almost like a company or like a business.
There has also been many pallets of bricks spotted around the towns where the riots have been happening, as well as many residential neighbourhoods, leading many to think that they might be the next targets. There has also been many theories about where these bricks came from, some pointing the finger at the police, as an excuse to crack down on protesters. But I think, with the evidence I've seen, it's more likely agitators, like Antifa, who have been leaving these pallets of bricks around in the hope of driving protests into violent riots. There has been a few videos of police clearing up pallets of bricks when they come across them. And then there was this bus that was stopped and seized by police, which contained large amounts of weapons, which shows to me at least their intent on violence. The point of these riots is to protest police brutality. They want a less militarised police force on the streets, but they have gone absolutely the wrong way about it. Because with riots, looting, violence and death at the hands of these thugs, the police have no choice but to stamp it out with rough riot tactics, as well as there now being actual soldiers on the streets of America in response. A bit of an own goal with that one. Black Lives Matter is something you see absolutely everywhere, no matter where you are or what you're doing. But what I've noticed is how black lives seem to matter much less depending on details like personal politics and who killed them, like when retired police captain David Dawn was killed by 24-year-old Stefan Cannon. But the wrong one was a police officer, so we'll just ignore that. And while we're on the subject of police, I can't be the only one that finds it extremely ironic that when a car nudges a protester who are openly advocating for the abolition of the police force, they start screaming that they want him arrested. An irony on par, I think, with Chris here supporting the riots, telling them to burn it down, burn it all down, and then absolutely terrified that they attacked somewhere close to him in their attempt to burn it all down. There have also been rumours that police are targeting people indiscriminately, even those who go out of their way to show that they're there in a medical capacity to look after the injured. But I also have to treat this with skepticism, as we see here.
Go around! Your shit up, bitch!
This girl has a red cross on her hat and top, which clearly marks her out as medical staff, and yet is still making a threat loud enough to be picked up by a camera in this absolutely chaotic scene. I would not put it past some of these rioters to dress up as medics thinking it'll make them immune to police countermeasures, so they can continue their criminal behaviour in peace. This is a group which openly talks about and encourages tactics such as gouging out people's eyes during protests instead of trying to punch people, because it's more effective and they want to try and destroy their enemy.
Practice things like an eye gouge. It takes very little pressure to injure someone's eyes.
Considering this mob have killed, looted, burned and beaten indiscriminately, I wouldn't put this past them either. So every story you hear about the police targeting a protester medic, just take it with a pinch of salt. That's not to say everything the police have done has been justified, but in a riot situation like we're dealing with in the US, you need a different and very aggressive rulebook to maintain order. That being said, the vast majority of police work doesn't involve riots, and I think the US police could use a crash course in de-escalation tactics, hopefully to prevent violence before it starts. There certainly are a few bad apples. Police brutality does exist, and to deny that is just to bury your head in the sand. There are numerous examples, but to accuse all police of being guilty of this is extremely hypocritical. This is a group that would be extremely offended if any other large group of people were judged based on the violence of just a few of that group. If it's pointed out that the black community of America make up only 13% of the population, but commit 50% of the violent crimes, that's considered to the left to be racist, and it's considered unfair to tar them all with the same brush. But I imagine it's much less than 50% of the police that are guilty of acts of brutality, but judging them all for the crimes of just a few is not only fine, but actively encouraged. It's very hypocritical. I've heard people say that those that stood and watched George Floyd die are just as guilty. And I won't disagree, they were complicit. But I think the best way to change the police department is to join it. Be the person who would have stepped in and prevented it, instead of just waiting around for others to bring around the change that you want to see. Join the police force yourself and do some good. So what's been accomplished by BLM? Apart from filling the streets of America with soldiers and bringing the police down on them in full riot gear, there's a little sliver of land that was seized in Seattle by Antifa and other groups. In this little spit of land, they've taken over a police station, which was for some reason that escapes me left completely unlocked. They call this the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, which is a shining example of people taking control without government or law enforcement. A little pocket of communism inside America, after 2 days of which they ran out of food and had to beg on Twitter for charity, and was taken control of by what is essentially a warlord. This is Raz Simone. He and his gang of heavily armed thugs took control by force and have since the time of making this have beaten the ever-loving tar out of 2 people, one of which he stole the phone of. Well, perhaps that guy could file a report with the police. People try and defend this dismal failure of Antifa and friends by saying things like, it was never meant to be some kind of uprising, it was just a staging area for protests. So that's why they didn't try harder when civilians started taking down the barricades and letting traffic through. I call this absolute bobbins for 2 reasons. 1, the protests and riots are still ongoing. Well, at the time of writing this anyway. And 2, why call it the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone if it was just a staging area? Given the name and some Antifa sympathiser even went to the trouble of designing a flag for it, it certainly seems like you were trying to make more than just a staging area. They've managed to get the Minneapolis City Council to announce their intention to disband the actual police force. If you can actually believe such a thing. I'm sure it'll go better than the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. Let's just hope no stray warlords wander by, or any of these kids need to get in touch with the police because someone bumped them and their friends with a car. George Floyd wasn't the hero people make him out to be, but he didn't deserve to die. It just seems to me that the black community are so desperate for some kind of hero along the lines of Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks, that they'll give that honour to anyone who's wronged by the police as long as the colour matches. Mr. Floyd might have been a criminal. He might have done some very unforgivable things, but I honestly do think that he was trying to turn his life around. He was working 2 jobs in a new city for a new start. A city that he came to love, that you're now burning down in his name. It's not what he would have wanted. I don't presume to speak for him, that falls to his brother.
So if I'm not over here wilding out, if I'm not over here blowing up stuff, if I'm not over here messing up my community, then what are y'all doing? What are y'all doing? Y'all doing nothing. Because that's not going to bring my brother back at all. It may feel good for the moment, just like when you drink. But when it comes down, you're going to wonder what you did.
And what's absurd is the protests have spread outside of America and across Europe, with 27 police officers being injured in London. That's just one night of riots in what the BBC called, in a fantastic moment of blind bias, as mostly peaceful protests. The idea of protesting American police brutality on the streets of London is extremely confusing. I have absolutely no doubt they've attempted to justify it to everybody and themselves with some extremely long and convoluted excuse, but personally I think the reason is a little more straightforward. When you've become accustomed to getting preferential treatment from people, then when you do get treated as just equals, it feels like discrimination. The fact that a black person can get a white person on their knees licking their boots on command like a well-trained dog is absolutely disgraceful and an embarrassment. How can you treat somebody as an equal after that and not have them think you're intentionally discriminating against them? They've been defacing war memorials, commemorating real, bona fide anti-fascists who stood up to Nazi Germany, and whose legacy these vile, violent half-wits are now disgracing. They've pulled down statues, and now they're talking about pulling down the statue of Admiral Lord Nelson, our greatest war hero, in my opinion anyway. The defacing of war memorials isn't something limited to just Britain, however. It's taking place in America too, and BLM defaced a memorial of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. For reference, this is the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. That's all for now, folks. If I don't stop now, I'll ramble on for hours, as I'm pretty sure I've only covered the tip of this particular iceberg. So, lovely viewers, if left to BLM and Antifa, whose statue would they choose to erect and why? I'll put the answers that make me laugh the most at the end of my next video, and as always, thank you for your time.